Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third episode of Free Lunch, your exploration of the themes that affect our economic lives. We are excited to be hosting this podcast again. My name is Kim Kariuki, and I'm joined by Ken Gishinga. And we are having lunch. Ken, what are you having for lunch?
Well, Kim, I'm just having my normal Wednesday ugali. Nothing too fancy. How about you?
To be honest, I have continued with the same regiment of nothing but hot water and lots of blankets. It's cold in Nairobi today.
It is.
Great. So today we are having a different conversation that I feel like a number of our participants and listeners and avid followers would really find interesting. Today we're talking about the transport sector and in the interventions that are being proposed to make it easier for commuters in the difficult times that Kenyans are finding themselves in. And on that, Ken, I know you've been talking to people on the ground and trying to understand the perspectives of ordinary Kenyans. What do you have for us?
Yes, indeed. This is something that I hold very dear to heart. The issue of bus fare is something that affects the ordinary Kenyan, and I'm very passionate about such topics. So when I read the topic about NTSA coming up with mandatory guidelines that will ban the use of cash for bus fare and people will need to use cashless solutions, I was quite curious on what people felt, and I spoke to a couple of people about that.
Great. In fact, why don't we just take a quick listen and then we can carry over the conversation.
With me, I'm okay with M-Pesa, and I think to me it's very much efficient because at times you see you don't have coins, just little money. Maybe I'm not okay with withdrawing them, but I'd rather pay them by M-Pesa. To me, it's fine, and I've been doing it, so I'm okay with that.
Cool. So very interesting insights. Who was that you had a chance to speak with?
Yeah, that was just a restaurant I'm managing a local restaurant, and she serves me my daily coffee, and I was just curious on what her take was, and she seemed to be quite pleased about it. It's convenient. It's the beauty about M-Pesa or digital currencies, there are no denominations. So even if you pay something as random as 17 shillings, you'd still be able to do so. So from her perspective, it seems to be a convenience factor, which seems to be a common theme, especially when you talk to most passengers.
No, such a valid point. And I like that the conversation organically went to the idea of mobile wallets and mobile transfer services. But did you get a sense, or do you have a sense of whether the same perception would be true if you were to use a card? So back in 2013, 2014, there were a number of FSPs or financial service providers that came up with cards like Prepare and Beba Pay, etc. Do you feel like there will be the same appetite, interest, excitement for cards as compared to using mobile money?
Wow, that's such a powerful question, Kim. And it's an interesting point because I think anytime you talk about cashless in Kenya, almost everybody gravitates towards M-Pesa.
Yeah.
If this was the United States, everybody would gravitate around a debit or a credit card. So it's interesting how sometimes words also are anchored in a certain way, so much so when you say cashless in Kenya, somebody quickly thinks M-Pesa. I think it just shows how ingrained M-Pesa in not only in our economy, but even in our psyche, in terms of payments, that actually for the first time since I did that interview, even I am thinking that cashless does not necessarily mean M-Pesa. You can have cards and you can have all these near-field communications devices. So I think it's interesting to see how even I am sort of caught up in that bias.
No, it's fine. It's the M-Pesa bias is with us to stay, I suppose. But it's interesting. So both you and I have both ridden in public service vehicles, and from a customer experience point of view, I love the fact that a shift to digital whether we're talking about M-Pesa or we're talking about having a prepaid card where you've loaded money onto. I like the fact that there'll be a lot of convenience. You don't have to struggle with getting change. So if your route is only going to cost, or if your trip is only going to cost 50 cents, and maybe you have $5, like you don't want necessarily to be struggling with the operator to get change. And that at least is amazing. But then why I began to think about cards, or prepaid cards for that matter, is in the same public service vehicles. Sadly, there's a strong opportunity for you to lose your assets because, while you're trying to pay for your ticket, somebody else might be eyeing your clutch purse or your phone or your wallet. So you can imagine a scenario where you pull out your phone to start trying to pay your your bus fare, and then somebody looks at you and says, give me your phone. And then they're not saying that in a nice, pleasant way. And they definitely don't want to just check out the model of your phone. They actually want it to keep. What do you think, Ken?
Well, I mean, that's very, very true. When you talk about card payments, it just took me back to my college days in Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And we had these university student cards.
Mm-hmm.
And you could top them up. It was part of the Massachusetts train authority system, and the same thing was also in Chicago. So you could top up something like $20, and you could use it for X amount of trips.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember it was a very, very convenient tool because you didn't have to always have cash in your pocket. Well, I know some people who say that sometimes savings becomes harder when you have these cashless options because you're all constantly swiping.
Yes.
Constantly. Cash sometimes has this, oh, I'm paying so much for this, so I need to be very careful. But cashless, the simplicity of it sometimes makes savings a problem. And I've had a couple of people saying that. But what you raise about the security issue, I think is very true, especially right now with what's happening right now with so many companies laying off so many people, and there are so many unemployed people. The issue of security, I've seen from people very close to me, getting in situations where their phones are stolen and such things. So yeah, definitely. But one would ask, would that have still happened if they were using cash? I mean, it becomes very hard to say, yeah.
No, and totally so. So on the second point of your statement first, there's a scenario that, given that Kenyans, or at least most East Africans, tend to be multi-SIMmed because we're trying to maximize rates and offers across different networks, there's a school of thought that would suggest that you might end up finding that people will use less attractive phones for paying for their transport. So if you use a very basic phone, so maybe the first generation basic phone, there'll be less of a temptation for folks to steal that. But again, that also, of course, is assuming that you have the money to afford more than one phone. Likely, people will end up switching SIM cards, etc., which can be quite complicated. But I also like the fact that you somehow managed to bring in Boston and Chicago into this. Now, for those of us who went to more rural, or colleges in more rural parts of the world, we did not have cards to use the public transport. But, it was very much a cash system there. And I remember having to make sure that I would go and get $20 worth of quarters, so that if I need to either feed the washing machine or get into a bus, I had enough coins to actually make sure I could pay for my trip. But nonetheless, good points on this idea of digitization and its ability, and at least ability to solve some consumer pain points and in transit. But the thing that I'm still curious about, so this isn't Kenya's first time at trying to unlock cashless payments. And, it's a bit sad that in 2013, when the NTSA really tried to get this going, it was, forced to, or at least it was encountered with a bit of resistance from different quarters. Can you remember those those times, what life was like?
No, I definitely remember. I think the push for cashless solutions has been there for, as you said, the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And it's not always been as easily adaptable as we'd like to imagine. I remember, and not only in the transport system, even in the tourism system. I remember there was a
Right.
local commercial bank that was trying to come up with a card for Masai Mara. If you go to Masai Mara, you'd get a card and you top up the card and you'd swipe anywhere within Masai Mara, but there was a lot of opposition, and I guess it's because there was no leakage, revenue leakage, that
Correct.
sometimes people tend to use. So yeah, I mean, definitely in the transport space, we've had things such as Beba Pay coming there, but I think even more profoundly is even before these formal cashless solutions came to be, they already were elements of very interesting transactions, which I think I might have touched on in our first episode, where there was that young man who was paying for his bus fare using airtime. This was a young man in Meru who used the bus ride, and really it was 20 shillings. He didn't have the 20 shillings, so he sent 20 shillings worth of airtime to the conductor, who accepted it. And in that particular ecosystem, it was a cashless payment.
Yes.
And so I think sometimes we think of the formal fintech solutions,
yes,
and we forget the very foundations of M-Pesa came from a study that saw how people were transferring airtime to each other. And that is sort of one of the things that gave the birth to thinking about M-Pesa. So, but in terms of the formal payments, yes, this have been in the last few years. There are people who are concerned about privacy issues, which I thought was a big thing. And I thought maybe when I talk to people around the street, I would get that same opinion, but it didn't quite come up. And in fact, it made me think, is privacy a middle class concern? Is it something that every Kenyan does not even think about at that point? But at that point, I think those issue of people are thinking this could be used for taxation. All these conductors were worried that the owners would have this tight leash on them because as it works right now, matatu owners are just paid an agreed upon amount.
Right.
So whether you get more than that, that can be your savings. But when the owner actually knows to the last cent how much you earned, sometimes you don't have that latitude, and it kind of changes the social contract between the owner and the conductor. So I think those are the things that not everybody wanted out in the broad daylight.
Yes.
And possibly those are the things that maybe hindered the implementation.
I totally agree. And you've talked about something there in passing that could easily be taken for granted. And it's around how the ecosystem works. So you're suggesting that, the vehicle owner cares about a certain daily income. And so if more is made than that, the operators get to keep, so the driver or the conductor. If less is made than that, the operators have to dig into their pockets to make sure that the shortfall is covered. And digitization, at least back then, was viewed that this would provide too much visibility on the actual earnings on a day-to-day basis within the transport sector, and that will sort of deny the operators the ability to top up and earn a little bit more. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think the matatu sector thrives heavily on information asymmetry between the owner, the conductor, even the police, who are constantly stopping these people. And unfortunately, the bribery culture is still quite heavy in the transport sector, where you find matatus constantly bribing policemen and policewomen to get away with things, and sometimes they don't like those kind of payments paid using cashless solutions because of the traceability.
Correct.
So even when you talk about anonymity, it's not always anonymity in a good way. It's always anonymity in a bad way. So you find definitely there's always appetite to sabotage anything that sort of exposes that whole ecosystem.
But that's a good point. So you've talked about bribes, and I like the word you used earlier, which is revenue leakages. So if you think of this as a leakage, so on the one hand, I feel like then the operators are put in a very weird space because part of the reason why the regulator or the Transport and Safety Authority, NTSA, was excited about cashless payments a couple of years back for the sector is that you could potentially weed out some of these revenue leakages. But I feel like the operators are put in a hard spot because when their vehicle is stopped and maybe it doesn't have one of the many 20 things that it should have, the tires might be worn, or there's no reflector, or one of the indicators might be busted. In that moment, the operator is faced with some cognitive dissonance, right? So he either keeps entertaining this officer on the implications of being in contravention to the law, or keep the vehicle running because then he's thinking about his top up and how much he'll earn extra from his route, and in addition to the owner's needs of how much daily income is being expected. So I feel like then the operator is put in between a rock and a hard place where he has to facilitate some sort of revenue leakage so that the vehicle can keep going and keep running. And in all of this, then the owner is more or less, and really when it's the owner who should be bearing the responsibility of the fact that, hey, if my vehicle is not roadworthy, those requests, I should be taking the hit, not my workers, right?
Very, very well said. Maybe to unpack that structure, I think sometimes we need to understand first the owners. These are people who often have full-time jobs somewhere, and they're not necessarily tracking what the conductor is doing from 9 to 5. So there's a lot of agency on the part of the conductor, and I think that's why the agreement is structured in the sense that if you can make sure the owner gets his 2,000, 3,000 shillings every day,
right?
Whatever else happens is yours. So there's that huge latitude, which
right.
Sometimes operators really, really enjoy. But as you say, it's more than the two. There are other people that come in. There are customers. There's the police that come in, and even the police have found ingenious ways of going around this. And don't ask me how I know this, but it's many policemen also sometimes tell the conductors to go withdraw from a certain agency, right. So that the money is not directly transferred to them. So it's a very complicated system that heavily benefits from a cash economy. And that's why I guess the solutions always tend to be frustrated. But I've always had the opinion of, why don't we have both solutions? Why don't you have both the cash and the cashless? I found it strange that NTSA wanted to make it mandatory in that sense. For me, I've always felt there is value to cash. It speaks to some people, and when some of the interviews we'll play later on, you'll see people who still feel there might be some people who might be excluded when everything goes digital. So I think for me personally, I've always favored for having both options and let people choose. I think, but one fundamental point I think we need to really think about is the issue of cash, well, the Kenya shilling here being a legal tender. And I think it's a very powerful point, because you have to understand what is a legal tender. And the strict definition of a legal tender is, this is a medium of exchange or a currency that has the ability to extinguish debt. In fact, that's a word. It has the ability to extinguish debt. So how far can a society go by making cash payments not be the case? Are we contravening some aspects of the principle of a currency? I think that's a very, very important point, because the way it was contemplated is the Kenya shilling, the note, should be able to settle any debt that has been in cards. So when people say that I will not accept this kind of payment, you know, is there a right that is being denied to the person who wants to make that payment, given that this is the legal tender of a currency which must be accepted in any transaction? So I think that's a fundamental point that maybe even legal experts need to weigh in.
So that is such a good point. And maybe let's do two things. One, let's quickly recap. So if you're listening on this, we are trying to unpack this issue of the National Transport and Safety Authority looking to push for stronger digitization and to introduce cashless payments back into the sector. So we're trying to think about what are the pros and cons. This has been tried in the past. Why didn't it work? And then Ken's brought up a very interesting point of, could that be systematically excluding some people? So Ken, again, I know you've been hitting pavement and talking to folks. Maybe let's listen in to some of the perspectives that you shared and learned from your investigations. And then we can come back and tackle this issue and explore, all right, even if we circle back on, yes, if we take a point of, hey, let's try to push for digital payments, will this work this time around, or will it just be back to same old in a very short span of time? So, all right, so let's listen to what Ken you came up with, and then we can circle back on this issue. I like the idea of not creating exclusion because, or in a view to try and move towards digital solutions.
It's not a bad idea for the government to try modern systems, but as they are trying, they should think of that old lady in the village, that young student who is not able to access the modern system.
No, very interesting perspectives, Ken. I'm really curious how you got people to open up and share with you such powerful insights over your coffee. Was this also a further conversation during coffee in the morning?
No, it wasn't. This was just a relative at my home. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting how people sometimes answer questions, because it was interesting when people, first, people definitely have an opinion on such matters.
Mm-hmm.
But when they realize now we might need to record them, I think sometimes people feel now they need to refine it a bit more. So it's also
Yes.
a powerful use of
Yes.
the cognitive part of surveys and how much buyers service carries.
Yes. So we talk about in the biz this idea of the Hawthorne effect, right? So people, just the sheer act of watching someone, the fact that I know I'm being watched or I'm being recorded, my behavior changes. So, a classic example, think of us in class. If you're talking and you're just randomly, talking to your friends, you likely speak in a certain way. And then all of a sudden, if somebody you want to impress walks in, you likely change your language. You will likely, sit up straight. You likely try to have a bit more diction and poise in your speech. So, people's behavior changes depending on what they feel is happening around them.
You're certainly the expert on behavioral economics there.
Thank you, sir. But yeah, no, you're talking about this issue of, is this going to create further division? Are we excluding people who have less access to assets like phones or the ability to purchase prepaid cards or load prepaid cards? And then you raise an even more fundamental issue of, why are we denying the use of legal tender? Why can't these systems run in parallel? And my thought actually on that was, this time around, at least the NTSA was trying to introduce this for very different reasons. So back then, it was all about, hey, can we block and lock in some of these revenue leakage opportunities? Now it's actually from a perspective of enhancing contact tracing. So, the Kenyan economy has been experiencing a whole bunch of doldrums because of the COVID-19 crisis, and part of reopening and easing inter-county movement restrictions is being able to trace individuals. So the theory of the school of thought is, if you have people boarding a public service vehicle and they're using cards or they're using some sort of cashless system, you will be able to know who paid based on their data based on the mobile wallet metadata or the card metadata. And then from that, you could potentially trace, who was likely infected and who came into contact with the affected persons. So I think I liked it from that perspective, but you're totally right in terms of, should we have both systems? Should we consider both systems? But I agree, or maybe it's a scenario where, to avoid some of this inclusion issues, as you're boarding the vehicle at the terminus, you have an opportunity to get your card at that point, and then you convert your currency, your physical cash currency into digital currency. But either way, I think you would still end up with this weird scenario where somebody is holding cash, and that still opens up an opportunity for bribes, leakages, etc. But Ken, keen to think about what are your thoughts on, can digitization be a way to help us reopen the economy and restart intercounty movement?
Well, when you talked about cashless payments, when the issue of financial inclusion has been heavily anchored on cashless solutions. So when this lady that I spoke to tried to spin the debate on its head and said that it could actually be an avenue for exclusion, I was like, wow, that's a profound point which I needed to stew over a bit. And in a sense, I could see where she was coming from, because one of my good friends yesterday got robbed of his phone, his mobile phone, as he was just leaving his house. Assuming that this situation had these mandatory payments had already been implemented, I'm just trying to wonder how he could have boarded a matatu to go to possibly town or even the hospital,
right?
To get checked. It would have been impossible, because no matatu would have accepted cash, and he would have to find some stranger to pay for him through M-Pesa. It would have been a bit tricky in that sense.
Yeah.
And that's just maybe a temporary situation. But even think about now people who up country, your grandmothers, your grandfathers, who might not always be very digitally savvy, and all they need is to take a 10 shillings matatu trip to downtown. Are they likely to change their behavior because of these payment modes? Because it has been shown that sometimes even the payment preferences can change how people behave in certain ways. So the issue we bring about contact tracing, I think it's a very interesting point. But it makes me wonder, why would that not happen in a marketplace or in a supermarket or in a church? I mean, there's so many spaces where people congregate so tightly. Why is there such an overzealous targeting of the transport sector? That makes me wonder, because these are the things that will be and I guess that's where the operators also get suspicious. They say this is not the only place where people gather. There are so many other places. Why are we not implementing those solutions there? So personally, I've always said, let the options be with the people. Let the people who opt in. Let the people who, for their reason, whether good or bad, want to opt out. Even they have that option.
No, it's a good one. So I guess I was, without being overly optimistic, I was excited by the fact that around the time when this conversation was happening, we were all looking forward to June 6th, the D-Day that the president was going to announce whether lockdown restrictions have been lifted, whether intercounty movement has ceased, or at least has been allowed. And so the thing that I was salient on was the fact that, if you can use this as a way to keep track of who's likely to be infected, and it's credible and possible and effective, then potentially you could ease restrictions on intercounty movement. So I think I saw it from that perspective of, okay, if we can keep track of person X who left Isili and was on his way to Thika, maybe to go buy produce, turns out that person, when they got to Thika, fell sick, then we can figure out, okay, what vehicle did they use? Then who else was in that vehicle? and then be able to administer, quick supportive action. But I hear you that, that same argument is true. Why didn't we do that for markets? Why don't we sort of use cashless payments everywhere? I'm a bit of a DFS freak, so I'd love the idea of digital financial services being used everywhere, but I can understand, you're totally right, especially for folks who are less technology savvy. That could be a problem. And you touched about privacy, touched on this issue of privacy, and even on that, there will be problems. So imagine somebody who doesn't know what their PIN is, and so they have to rely on their son or somebody else, or a piece of paper where they've written their PIN, and then that piece of paper gets misplaced. So you can all of a sudden find a scenario where, your mobile money balance is susceptible to being withdrawn fraudulently, and that causes further problem. And in fact, some of the criticisms of using this cashless payment, aside from the privacy issues with fraud, there was also, do I really want Big Brother keeping track of my movements, and who is going to use that information, and how is it going to be accessed? Will it be with my consent or not? And then, of course, we can't escape the elephant in the room where, unlike in Nigeria, where there's a preponderance of operators, our market here is a bit more dominated by a few players. And so, would this further accentuate the dominance of those types of players? And what does that mean for competition and innovation into the long run?
Wow, those are very, very profound points. I love how you've summarized it, and I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. No, so just again to recap for folks who are listening in, or wondering where we're going with all of this, still trying to untackle this issue of DFS solutions, cashless payments, matatu industry, or the public sector transport industry. Is this a good idea, bad idea? Are we excluding people or not? Why was it only the transport sector that was selected for this? Why not the other sectors within the informal economy? And, is this, even if this was to work, would it last? And maybe, Ken, we can speak to that issue now. Do you think that this time round, so aside from all the issues that happened in 2013, do you think this time round the digital payments or cashless payments will work to support and to shore up the industry?
Well, I think cash is still king in many parts of Kenya.
Yeah.
Especially in the informal spaces, whether it's in agriculture, farmers love cash.
Yeah.
Matatu conductors, because of how the incentives are structured, still love cash. And I don't think it's something that should be shoved down the throats of people. I think it should be presented as a convenient opportunity to make a payment, and maybe organically sort of grow that segment in a way. I think in that way it brings less suspicion. People feel the opinion matters in that sense, and there's a bit more of sort of a better uptake. So if they can't take that sort of like gradual long-term approach, I mean, think about M-Pesa. When M-Pesa started in Kenya, it was something that was considered for poor people who don't have bank accounts. But 13 years later, you go to every 5-star hotel and they have a till number for M-Pesa, and that's organically, it's become almost the de facto mode of payment. But it's taken some time and people have seen the benefits. I'm just wondering, had the government said it was a mandatory usage of M-Pesa in 2010, would it have had sort of that positive uptake? So I think it's just, as you say, presenting an opportunity. I've never liked the fear approach. I've always said present the value, and if it's truly valuable, people will sort of adapt into it very naturally and would not need to be coerced. If it's a taxation issue, I think they just need to address it in a way. I know right now they have sort of like what they call the single business license fee, where you pay a flat fee in terms of taxing. But I don't think it should be something that should be sort of like roped in so that people feel they are more of a part of the taxable bracket. So I think so some of the sort of the issues that maybe policymakers might want to tweak as they sort of review the way forward on this.
Correct. No, I think you've touched on very important points that I totally agree with. From my perspective, I think I'm starting from a place of saying if it's ever to work, I think the conditions are somewhat right for it now, especially since that we've already created a bit of a culture, a norm around processing and accepting digital payments. So it seems like if there was a time when there's a very strong use case to reintroduce this, especially if the carrot on the other end of the stick is we can resume intercounty travel. I think that would be exciting to explore. But again, like with everything, it's super important to make sure that we're weighing up the pros and the cons. We don't get excessively optimistic in the light of everything else going on. And then that we are not shying away from evidence to the contrary, right? So there's this idea of confirmation bias, that it's really easy to look at all the things that are happening and say, oh, these things are positive and they are supporting my point of view, and so this should work. And sometimes we could end up, or central planners could end up falling into that bracket and saying, okay, we want to open intercounty travel, let's enforce digital payments, and then we can reopen digital travel. But we also need to be mindful of the other bits of information, like what does this do for innovation further? Does it crowd out smaller players? Does it create an opportunity to introduce exclusion, especially technological exclusion? So you have some sort of a stigmatization of folks who are not really able to use digital services as effective as others. And then I'm even just more curious about how that revenue share will happen. So in 2013, the idea was the players were getting involved because there was a 1% transaction fee. In COVID, it seems like the transaction fees have been voided, especially on small amounts. So what would be the impetus this time around for those same fintechs to want to be engaged, unless we are saying that there'll be some sort of a fee? And if that's the case, then why don't I just use cash, right? So then these policies need to be consistent and supporting each other. Otherwise, it will be another project that doesn't end up hitting the goals that it should.
That's a very good summary, and I think as policymakers think through these issues, I think is the issue of focus groups, sort of like engaging various focus groups, whether it's the owners, the matatus, whether it's the operators and passengers, and just being able to consult very widely before being able to implement. I think it came as a surprise when it hit the headlines of the Business Daily, and I think more people would have appreciated it sort of to come up sort of on the tail end of a consultative
process. Correct. No, I guess, Ken, that is our time and that's it for Free Lunch for today. But any parting shots, anything that you're eagerly itching and want to tell our listeners?
I think it's a great observation. I love some of these topics that touch on the ordinary Monanchi, because they can easily be looked at from a macro perspective, but they have huge consequences at the micro level. And if we can be exploring such things, if viewers have listeners have topics of such a nature which would be interesting, they could definitely let us know through our social media handles.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening in. It's been our pleasure to host Free Lunch today. Hopefully, you've enjoyed your lunch and you're getting ready to go about the rest of your day and have yourself a good one. Please stay safe. Remember to practice all and obey the requirements for social distancing and keeping yourself safe and your loved ones safe. And we will catch you next time on our next episode of Free Lunch. Take care, everyone. Bye.